It's not until a single unexpected event shifts the equilibrium that you truly realize how delicate life is. What was meant to be a serene family trip in the mountains, an opportunity for us to bond, turned into something Levy was adamant about. He was always conscious of public perceptions, determined to display us as an ideal family, despite our marriage having become more transactional than intimately connected. Edward, his child from a previous marriage, remained aloof, never truly embracing me as his stepmom. My agreement to the getaway wasn't fueled by enthusiasm, but rather out of routine compliance. I adhered to the pattern of agreeing, acquiescing, and keeping the peace, but that weekend, tranquility eluded me. Please subscribe to my channel for more intriguing true tales like this one. Make sure to watch this video to the end and like it, because this story will captivate you. Don't forget to hit the like button to show your appreciation. A simple error set everything in motion. A booking mix-up at the lodge when Levy reserved the wrong dates, leaving us with one fewer room. He brushed it off, suggesting Edward and I share a room for just one night, which he downplayed as trivial. As I lay in the dimly lit room with Edward, the true fragility of the family dynamic we had crafted became evident. Looking back, I wonder if everything was bound to fall apart eventually, or if that one night at the lodge triggered the collapse. The fallout surpassed what I could initially fathom. This is the tale of how everything unraveled. The drive to the lodge was long and quiet, dominated by the kind of silence that surfaces when there's little left to communicate. Levy focused on driving while I watched the landscape from the passenger seat. In the back, Edward was absorbed in his phone, headphones on. This scene was all too familiar. Our family excursions had always felt like this, individuals moving together yet disconnected. "Did you pack the hiking boots, Levy?" I asked, breaking the silence, to which Levy replied curtly, "Yes," and refocused on the road. Edward barely spoke throughout the trip, a pattern particularly pronounced in my presence. At 28, he exhibited a reserved, attentive demeanor, as if harboring private thoughts. He inherited his mother's dark hair and defined features, constant reminders of the woman Levy cherished before me. I held no resentment towards Edward for this. His mother's passing during his teenage years had created a void no one, not even Levy, could fill. Still, a gap between us remained unbridged. Upon reaching the lodge, the setting sun painted the mountains golden. The lodge, modest yet charming, evoked memories of past family vacations. Levy handled check-in while Edward and I unloaded the car. Commenting on the nice surroundings, Edward surprised me. He glanced briefly my way before returning his focus to the luggage. The lodge was warm and inviting, with its wood-paneled walls and cozy furniture. Yet, Levy's demeanor changed on his return from the desk, indicating a problem. He informed us there'd been a mistake. Only 2 rooms were available for tonight, with the third ready the next day. I understood the situation's implications. "What's the plan?" I asked. Levy replied briskly, "We'll sort it. You and Edward can share one room." A sensation of unease hit me, but I chose not to protest. Levy had moved past it, treating it as a minor inconvenience. The room with Edward was small but cozy, featuring a queen-sized bed and a lamp casting soft light over the wall. Discomfort set in immediately. I distracted myself by organizing in the tiny bathroom, while Edward remained engaged with his phone. As night fell, tension filled the room. "Take the bed," Edward offered. "Don't be silly," I replied, standing near the window. "It's large enough for both." He hesitated, but agreed. Lying on my side of the bed, I stared at the ceiling. Edward was beside me, his breathing soft. I tried convincing myself everything would be fine, yet instinctively I sensed otherwise. That night felt transformative. The room settled into quiet stillness with only crickets chirping outside. The lamp's soft glow painted shadows on the walls, creating a surreal ambience. Edward scrolled on his phone while I feigned reading a book, but my mind wandered elsewhere. Dinner had been quiet, as were most of our meals. Levy shared stories about his work. Edward and I listened, but were not fully engaged. I couldn't pinpoint when the tension began. Perhaps it was always there, a latent unease I had ignored for years. but could no longer overlook. "You're not really reading that, are you?" Edward unexpectedly asked, disrupting the silence. "Why do you say that?" I responded casually. He smirked, setting his phone aside. "We've been on the same page for the last 20 minutes. I chuckled softly, embarrassed. Edward shifted, appearing more relaxed. "What's on your mind?" he asked. His question surprised me, and my response was rushed. He raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "Come on, Abigail. I know you better than that." The way he spoke my name stirred something within me that wasn't the norm of stepmom or silence. It felt different. I let out a deep breath. Leaning back against the bed's headrest, I reflected on past times. Weren't family outings fun once? Edward nodded, a softer expression on his face. Yes, they were, when it was just me and Dad before I saw the pretense. His words struck a chord, though not inaccurately. "I've tried," I admitted softly, "to make this work. I want to be someone you and your dad can rely on." He acknowledged it with gentle honesty, showing appreciation even if unspoken. For the first time, it felt like the barriers were falling. We talked for hours, sharing frustrations about Levy and fond memories of Edward's trips with his mom. "She was the glue," Edward said longingly. "Dad was always working, but she made us whole." I nodded, my heart heavy. "Following in her footsteps is challenging," I said softly. He replied plainly, "It doesn't have to be." The conversation eased into a comforting silence. I turned off the lamp, letting the moonlight take over. He assured me it was all right, his voice soft yet composed, yet the moment seemed unusual. Every slight movement he made felt amplified, highlighting our closeness. "Are you all right?" Edward asked, softly breaking the silence. I hesitated, my throat dry. I answered affirmatively, though it wasn't the truth. "Remember who you are," he said, his voice growing unexpectedly tender. Before I could speak, he moved nearer, his warmth surrounding me. I froze next to Edward. I delicately questioned, "Do you ever feel like you're acting?" He asked suddenly, his voice raw, living in a way that's not true to oneself, meeting all expectations, yet never finding genuine experience. His words struck a deep chord with me. Every day, I silently acknowledged the raw and honest words between us, and then it happened, neither dramatic nor planned. One moment we were speaking quietly, the next his fingers brushed mine, and neither of us pulled away. "Is this all right?" he murmured. I should have refused, I should have left, but instead I turned towards him, my heart racing. "Yes," I whispered. When it ended, we lay silently. My mind was a storm of confusion and guilt, but I couldn't speak. "I'm sorry," Edward said, his voice cracking. "Silence doesn't apologize," I replied, my voice unsteady. "It's okay," I quickly added. "I don't know what this means," he confessed. "Neither do I whispered. Yet deep down, I understood. The next morning, I woke before Edward, slipping out of bed quietly as the dawn light filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. I dressed quickly, avoiding the mirror, and by the time Edward awoke, I was seated by the window, pretending to be captivated by the view of the mountains. He mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "This morning," I replied, keeping my tone even for a moment. He hesitated as if he wanted to say more, but merely nodded and headed to the bathroom without another word. When we met Levy for breakfast in the dining room, the tension between Edward and me was evident. Levy was blissfully unaware, sipping his coffee and commenting on the weather or our plans. However, I could feel Edward's intense gaze on me, and it took all my self-control not to look back at him. I convinced myself that the tension would lessen, the memory of the night would fade, and we would go back to normal. But as the day wore on, I realized that some actions, once taken, couldn't be undone. The drive home from the lodge was quiet. It wasn't the peaceful silence I had hoped for, but one filled with an uncomfortable expectation, as though unspoken words and thoughts were building up around us. Levy remained oblivious, humming and tapping his fingers on the steering wheel as he navigated the curving mountain roads. Edward sat in the back seat, gazing out the window while I looked ahead, my hands tightly clasped in my lap. I tried focusing on the scenery, the rolling hills, the forest, the golden light through the trees, but my thoughts always returned to before. Every detail was etched into my mind. Edward's breathing, the way our hands touched, seemed unreal, like a dream. yet its repercussions were undeniable and unavoidable. I caught a glimpse of Edward in the rearview mirror. He seemed calm, almost detached, but I noticed tension in his jaw and how tightly he clutched the armrest. We avoided each other's eyes, and I wasn't sure if that was a relief or a curse. As we eventually parked in the driveway, Levi was already stretching and setting his plans for the rest of the day in motion. He mentioned, "I have a meeting in a couple of hours, but we should do something tonight, maybe dinner at that new Ian's restaurant." "Sure," I replied without thinking, despite feeling uneasy about a family meal. Edward stayed quiet. He took his bag from the trunk and silently walked inside. The afternoon was filled with mundane tasks. I sorted laundry, tidied up the kitchen, and rearranged the bookshelves in the living room, anything to occupy my mind. Yet, my thoughts persistently drifted back to Edward. I couldn't help but revisit our conversation from the previous night, recalling how he spoke about feeling lost and pretending to be someone else. I remembered the silent empathy in his gaze, the kind I hadn't experienced in years, certainly not from Levi. My musings were interrupted by footsteps on the stairs. I glanced up to find Edward standing in the doorway, his hands tucked into his jeans pockets. He awkwardly said, "Hey," to which I responded, my voice more strained than intended. For a brief moment, silence ensued. Then he cleared his throat and glanced at the kitchen. "I was just going to get something to eat," I replied, stepping aside for him to pass. As he brushed past, a fleeting contact left me breathless. I focused on organizing the counter while he scavenged through the fridge, trying to ignore how my heart raced when he moved. He began, his tone cautious. "About last night." I tightened my grip on the dish towel. "We don't have to discuss it," I said quickly. "We can't just pretend it didn't happen," he insisted. "Why not?" I snapped, my tone sharp. "Because that's precisely what we need to do. Act like it never occurred and move forward." He stared at me, his expression indecipherable. "Is that truly what you want?" he asked. "What I want doesn't matter," I replied, voice quivering. "This is how it has to be. It can't happen again." "Why not?" he questioned. "Is it because it's wrong, inconvenient, or are you scared?" "Stop it," I cut him off, turning away. He moved closer, his tone softer. "You don't need to keep pretending, Abigail, not with me." "Please, Edward," I whispered, feeling a tightness in my chest. I expected him to argue or press further, but he just sighed and stepped back, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you." "It's already difficult," I confessed, voice barely audible. He nodded, his gaze lingering on me briefly before he left the room. That evening, Levi maintained his usual upbeat demeanor, discussing work and future plans. Edward and I feigned agreement, nodding and smiling at appropriate moments, yet the tension was palpable. At one point, Levi looked at Edward, curious. "You've been quiet today. Is everything all right?" "Yeah," Edward replied, exhaustion from the trip evident. Levi nodded, seemingly satisfied, and continued with his meal. Still, I felt Edward's eyes on me, heavy and probing, and it took all my strength to avoid meeting his gaze. Later, after Levi had gone to bed, I found myself pacing in the living room, thoughts racing. Pretending everything was okay felt impossible when it wasn't. I was so lost in my thoughts that I didn't notice Edward approach until he spoke. "Can't sleep?" he asked, voice quiet. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his expression careful. As he stepped further into the room, hands in his pockets, we stood in silence, the unspoken tension growing with every passing moment. "I don't know what to do," I finally admitted, my voice shaky. "Neither do I," he replied, eyes dropping to the floor, "but I know I don't want to lose us." His words felt like a blow, and I felt a tightness in my chest. We couldn't determine the pace of Edward's speech, although his voice sounded strained. Despite his hoarseness, I couldn't dismiss its significance to you. With tears welling up, I shook my head. "I realize this situation is unfair for everyone," he said, his voice faltering. "I just needed to hear your acknowledgement, even for a moment." Silence lingered between us until he stood, running a hand through his hair. "I'm going for a walk," he murmured quietly. "Take care," I whispered, feeling the emptiness in my words. He nodded and left, leaving me with my scattered thoughts. That night, as Levi slept peacefully by my side, I lay awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling. I felt as if I were trapped in a cage of my own making, unable to break free. Come morning, Edward was gone. His handwritten note on the kitchen counter stated, "I need some time to clear my head. Don't worry about me. I'll be fine. I just need to handle things on my own." These words struck me deeply, and I clutched the note, fear simmering inside. "What's going on?" Levy queried, entering the kitchen, phone in hand. "Edward has left," I responded, my voice fading. Levy frowned, taking the note. "What on earth does this mean? Where did he go?" he asked. "I don't know," I replied, tears brimming. With a sigh, Levy ran a hand through his hair. "He never thinks things through, he's probably just sulking." His dismissive attitude angered me. "He'll come back when he's hungry." "It's not sulking, Levy, he's genuinely upset." "What do you want me to do about it?" he retorted. "He's an adult. If he wants to behave childishly, that's up to him." I stared, shocked by his lack of empathy. "You really don't care, do you?" I asked. "Of course I care," he replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But I'm not chasing after him. He needs to learn to deal with his issues." Turning from him, I struggled to control my breathing, the weight of the situation suffocating. The days that followed were tortuous. I spent day and night worried about Edward's whereabouts, concerned for his safety and when he would return. I tried calling, only to reach his voicemail each time. I considered searching for him, but knew not where to start. One evening, while staring at my phone, Levy appeared unperturbed, going about his routine as if nothing had changed. My friend Luna called. "I haven't heard from you in a while," she said, her voice tinged with worry. "Is everything all right?" I paused, unsure of how to reply. "It's complicated," I finally admitted. "How so?" she pushed. Running a hand through my hair, I sighed. "Edward left. He gave no indication of his destination or return." "Did something happen?" she inquired sharply. I paused, the burden of truth weighing heavily. "It's just been tense recently," I said, not revealing full details. "I see," Luna said, unconvinced. "If you need to talk, you know I'm here." "Thanks," I whispered, uncertain if I truly meant it. After ending the call, I sat in silence, staring at the void where Edward once was. The absence felt palpable. I replayed our last conversation over and over, recalling his vulnerable eyes and the question I couldn't truthfully answer. "Was it a mistake to you?" Uncertainty gnawed at me. Perhaps it was a mistake, or perhaps something more profound, an admission I was not ready to make. All I knew was that I missed him, and that realization terrified me. The emptiness left by Edward was overwhelming. As days shuffled into weeks, the house grew heavier with silence. Levy continued as if nothing were amiss, immersing himself in work and brushing off any mention of Edward with indifference. "He'll be okay," Levy kept repeating. It's his usual pattern. But I wasn't okay, and I wasn't sure about Edward either. I would drive aimlessly on some afternoons, silently wishing to see him walking along a street or seated in a cafe. I kept checking his social media profiles, but there was no trace of him there. It was like he had vanished entirely. I couldn't shake off the feeling that his departure was somehow due to me. His note, though brief and seemingly casual, came at a significant time. What had I done to him to cause this? That question lingered, weighing heavily on me. No matter how I tried to distract myself, it was a Thursday evening when I discovered it. Levy had gone to a dinner meeting, leaving me alone to drift from room to room. Eventually, I found myself in Edward's room by accident. The faint scent of his cologne lingered in the air. I sat on his bed, my fingers unconsciously tracing the quilt's seams, imagining where he might be. My gaze fell on his desk, where a disheveled stack of papers was piled in a corner. Though I promised myself I wouldn't pry, my curiosity prevailed, and I began to sift through the papers. That's when I found the letter. Despite not being addressed to me, I immediately sensed it was about me. "Dear Abigail, I don't know how to say this. I can't bring myself to express it aloud, so I opted to write it down. I hope you never discover this, but if you do, maybe it will help you understand. I can't stop thinking of you, of us, of that night. I know it was wrong and perhaps meaningless to you, but to me, it meant everything. You make me feel noticed, as if I'm more than a disappointment or failure. You give me a sense of worth, and I don't know how to deal with it. Though I've tried to move on, I can't, and that's why I have to leave. I apologize if I've made things harder. I never wanted to, but I can't stay here anymore, not in this state. Take care, Abigail. Sincerely, Edward. I read the letter over and over, and its weight seemed to grow heavier each time, leaving my hands trembling. Setting it aside with my mind racing, filled with emotions I struggled to decipher, I realized he left because of me, due to what transpired and my inability to handle it. Instead of feeling relieved that the temptation and risk were gone with him, all I felt was a profound emptiness threatening to swallow me. Levy returned home late that night, his tie loosened, with the scent of whiskey clinging to him. He dropped his briefcase by the door and headed straight to pour himself another drink. Without uttering a word, I followed, clutching the letter tightly. "Levy," I started, my voice shaking. He turned to me with tired eyes. "What is it, Abigail?" he asked. "I need to talk to you," I said, gripping the letter tighter. He sighed, setting his drink down. "Can it wait? I've had a long day." I surprised myself by firmly saying, "No, it can't wait." He frowned, crossed his arms, and I handed him the letter. "What's this?" he asked, taking it. "Just read it," I urged. He unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the content. His expression shifted from confusion to anger, then to something deeper. "What the? Who is this from?" he asked, his voice low and tense. "Edward," I whispered. "No kidding," he snapped back, waving the letter. "What does he mean by this? What happened, Abigail?" Levy's anger and disbelief pressed down on me. "Levy, what did you do?" he shouted, his voice bouncing off the kitchen walls. "I didn't mean for this to happen," I confessed as tears fell. "It was a mistake." "A mistake?" he repeated, his tone dripping with anger. "Do you call that a mistake?" I couldn't find the words. His fury was overwhelming. Levy left that night, slamming the door hard enough to echo throughout the house. I stayed on the kitchen floor for hours, staring at the letter clutched in my hands. I wanted to scream, cry, flee, and never return, but I found myself unable to move. The next morning, I forced myself to get up. The house felt eerily quiet without Levy and Edward, enveloping everything in an overwhelming gloom.